Hello, welcome to FX PhD. My name is Matt Leonard and this is class number 4 of arn201. Now in this class we're going to be spending our time looking at cameras and pre-object settings. So we've got, as always, enough to get through, and let's begin by moving into Maya. So the project we're going to be using this week is here in your downloads. It's class04_01. If I just load this up, so as you can see, it's a nice little Lego model. If we just move on in, it's a house based off of the Pirates of the Caribbean Lego series, along with a man and a couple of trees. Okay, so we're going to be using this to do most of our work this week. So it's lit, you can see, by a key light, a fill light, and then a backlight or top light. It's quite high to be a backlight, but this is going to be our lighting setup. Now with regards to render settings, we're going to keep them reasonably low just because we don't want to have to wait for long render times, but we will increase them as and when we need to. So at the moment I'm just going to take my AAs and I'm going to drop them down to 1. So we're going to have a very coarse, noisy render, but that's going to be fine for what we need, just to begin to see what's going on. So I have a camera set up, and you'll be able to see from perspective camera 1. This is my camera view, and if I just jump over to my film gate or my resolution gate, you can see roughly what we're getting there. So that's kind of the view we're going to go with. Now while we're there, we're just going to lock it down just so we don't end up moving it, and I'm going to do that just by selecting the translate and rotate, right clicking, and just going to lock selection. So that's just locked down and we're good to go. So let's just go ahead to our attribute editor and see what settings we have to play with. So I'm just going to close my normal camera attributes, film back, and open up the specific Arnold settings here, which are obviously the ones we're interested in. Okay, so first off we have this list of camera types. Cylindrical is useful for creating panoramic views and environment maps such as lat longs. The fisheye creates a fisheye view based on the field of view settings. Orthographic is obviously just a straight orthographic, no perspective, so objects do not appear to decrease in size as they are further away from the camera. Perspective would be what you would really define as a kind of a standard view. And then your spherical view, that's basically again used for environment maps, but whereas cylindrical gives you a kind of a lat long output, the spherical gives you a spherical output. Okay, so you can choose any of these, but the ones we're going to be focusing on mainly are the perspective view here. Next up we have our exposure settings. So before I start messing with these, let's actually have a look at our render. So if I show you the render settings I've got, we're just going to go with an AA of 1, diffuse, glossy and reflection, subsurface scattering down at 0. So that's what we're going to go with, and we'll just do an IPR render of the scene. So this is the kind of lighting setup I've got. Okay, so first off we have our exposure. Now this basically just works like a normal camera exposure. So if I increase this value by 1, it's going to basically go up 1 stop, doubling the brightness. So if I go to 1, you can see we get a doubling of the light, a double exposure time. Also we could go negative value, so we could go down a stop from our regular exposure, and that's going to obviously halve the amount of light, so it's going to get darker. Okay, so this can be really useful if you have everything set up but you just need to do some multiple exposures or just adjust the look of the scene based on the camera exposure. So again, I'm just going to put that up to 2, and you can see now we've obviously doubled the light again from our setting of 1. So I quite like it at 1, so I'm going to just leave my exposure there. Okay. Now next up we have this filter map, and this basically is really useful because we can use this to do things like vignetting, things like that. So first thing we need to do is we need to just get a kind of a map that we can use for this. So I'm going to come across to my node editor, press tab, and I'm going to go with a ramp So we just want a straightforward ramp texture. I can take my ramp texture and I can feed it into my camera. So let's again select my camera, middle mouse drag into my filter map. See, and it goes. I'm just going to stop this for a moment while we adjust our ramp. You can immediately see what's going on. We're going to go with, say, a radial or circular ramp. Let's see which one we like. Let's go with a circular. Let's lose this. And we're going to go with white in the middle because we want to make a kind of a vignette effect. Black at the top. And we don't want it to be too harsh. Maybe somewhere like there. And we'll go with a linear or smooth. I think smooth would be nice for this one. Okay, so having set that, you can see what we're getting here. If we now come back and just do a IPR of the scene, what you're going to see is that kind of vignetting effect taking place. You can see now that ramp is kind of creating this really nice vignette look to the scene. Now if I move this over here, drop this down a little bit, just open up this again, and we can now adjust on the fly. So if I was to push this higher up, what you're going to see is a lot of that black kind of moving away from the corners. So give it a moment to update. There you can see now we've got that much harsher black edge as we've really pushed that white area into the black, making a harsher line, pushing the darkness back from kind of the middle of the scene towards the edges. Again, I can bring that back and pull this down, so now we're only going to end up with a small area in the middle of the scene. So again, this could be actually used for like a transition effect if you wanted to do that, though obviously the advice would normally be to do this kind of thing in the comp full stop. So although it can do it, I wouldn't necessarily recommend baking in this kind of effect because we could achieve this directly, as I said, inside of the composite. But it's good to know that it can be done if and when we need to. So to get rid of that, I'm just going to right click on the filter map and we're just going to break the connection. Now sometimes with the IPR running, all this kind of thing can go a little bit slow because obviously Arnold is working away busily in the background, and when we're trying to do things within Maya that may be more intensive on kind of how the overall image looks, you may choose, as I would have done, to just stop your render taking place. So I'm just going to close that and just lose these. We don't really need these at the moment, so they can go. Next up, we have rolling shutter. And although we won't be looking at this, basically this just simulates the effect that you'd get from like a CMOS censored camera. So normally the correct setting would be top, so it rolls from the top downwards. And as your object moves across the screen, you're going to get that same kind of slanting or skewing effect you would see with digital cameras. Okay, so I'm going to leave that one off because it's not something we'd particularly want to have in this instance. Next up, the big one. This is depth of field, and I can enable depth of field obviously just by switching it on. Then I've got controls for the focal distance, how large the actual aperture is, and then I can determine things like the blade count, the curvature, and the rotation of the blades if I require. So first off, focal distance. So I'm going to make a new camera. Let's look through this camera and let's focus in on, say, this tree. So we're going to bring our tree here. Let's go with a view like that, somewhere like that. Okay, so go back to our 4 views. Let's take another measurement based on where our new camera is to the man. So we just want to go with a create measuring tool, distance tool. We're going to go from the camera to the man. Again, we just want to move that just to make sure we're in roughly the right place. So the man is there, camera is there. So that's giving us 21 units. So let's come across to here, come back to our camera information and set that now to focal distance of 21. Depth of field on. Let's go with 0.1 again. And let's do another render. So now you can definitely begin to see some of that depth of field taking place even on this first frame. Okay, so that while that just finishes off, you can definitely now see we've got this noise here on the side of the tree, and that indicates depth of field is taking place there. So again, I'm just going to grab my camera. I'm going to save this image once it's finished. There we go. I'm going to go up to 0.3 that we had before, and again just render the scene. So again, as this has now started going through, you can really see this kind of depth of field area that we're getting here. Now, in order to get rid of the noise, what we need to do is directly increase the AAs. So if I stop this and we select just say this section here, maybe with our man and this part of the tree, I come over to my render settings and I'm going to increase my AAs. I'm going to guess maybe somewhere like 5 might be the right amount. And while we're doing this, I'm just going to save this scene out as 02. I'm just going to say depth of field so you know this is kind of in the class where we're at. So again, I'm just going to render, but only render within this area. Now this is going to take quite a lot longer to render than it obviously is going to be because the anti-aliasing is now much higher. But what we should now see is a much smoother image, both overall and specifically in the depth of field area. Now, while that's running through, let's just have a discussion about these other settings here, where we've got the aperture blades, the blade curvature, and the blade rotation. Well, with the aperture blade set to 0, basically we're getting just a circular shape. Okay, anything above that, you're going to end up with like a 2, 3, 4, 5-sided shape. So if I just up this to 5, that's going to change our blades to a kind of a 5 shape. So anything out of focus won't go circular, but will go this more 5-sided look. Then we have the aperture blade curvature, and this basically is, as you can imagine, the curvature of the aperture sides. So a value of 0 gives us hard, straight edges, and if we increase this, we slowly get more and more curved, all the way up to 1. So 0 to 1 is the values that you want. Obviously, if we go a negative value, we're going to kind of pinch in and eventually make a star shape. So I'm just going to set that to maybe 0. Let's go with 25. And then the rotation, as you would have in other programs, that basically specifies the rotation of the blades in degrees. So I'm going to leave that at 0. That will just be fine. Okay. Now you can see this is running quite slowly, but mainly due to the fact that I'm screen recording at the same time. So I'm just going to pause the class while this finishes running through. Okay, so that's just finishing off, and you can really see the difference that increasing the AAs have made, especially down this side of the tree. We've got a much smoother look, and we may even choose that we want to push those AAs higher, but for time I'm going to just leave them at the size that they are, which I think was a value of 5. Okay, so I quite like this look, so I'm just going to move the camera around a little bit and maybe come with somewhere quite low down, maybe just looking across at the house like this. And I may move my Lego man as well. Just move him over towards the camera and just spin him around a little bit. Somewhere like that could be quite nice. Maybe just a little bit more like so. And again, I'm going to just work out where my camera is so that when we render our final shot, we're going to have some kind of depth of field taking place. Let's go with somewhere, which one is it? It's that one by the look of it, somewhere there. So we're looking at around 17, or rather 11 once we've moved it to there. So again, grab my camera and I'm just going to adjust this to 11 for the time being. And then these bits we can get rid of. Okay, they can go. And we'll jump back to our second camera, which is here. Now, next up in our settings, we have this UV control. So I'm going to turn off depth of field for a moment. UV mapping. This is really nice. This, again, basically enables you to take a UV map and use it to basically add some kind of lens distortion. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just drop my AAs down again to maybe 2. I'm going to render this out, having just saved it in case we hit any problems. So this is going to be 03 and this is going to be UVs. But the UVs are going to be specifically for lens distortion. That's what they do. So I'm going to render this so we've got something happening, and while it's rendering, I'm going to load up Nuke. Okay, so here we are. This is Nuke 8.0 V2 Beta 23. Just came out last week. So I'm going to read in a lens distortion chart that I have. So lens distortion charts, and I'm going to assume that I filmed my scene with, say, a 28mm lens on a Canon 5D. Okay, so here is the lens distortion chart that I made for that. So I'm now just going to go with a lens distortion node. I'm going to go across to grid analysis. It's a thin line, and I'm just going to say analyze grid, and I'm going to say align grid as well. So we can see that's now looking pretty straight and nice. So I turn off align grid, back to image distortion here, and the output type I'm going to say is displacement. Now I'm going to add a shuffle node, and I'm going to say take the motion, and you can see here this is the UV map that the lens distortion node has created. So I'm going to just say red and green. I'm going to set it to, well, I'll keep it this size for the time being. I'm going to do a right node. Let's come over to our Arnold class. Let's make a new folder here, which I'm going to call lens distortion underscore or dash UV. Say 28mm lens distortion .exr. Auto crop we're going to leave off, so we don't need to do anything like that. We just want the RGB. Scanline 1 zip is going to be fine, and we're going to do a render, and we're just going to render out a single frame. Out it goes. So you've got the setup. I'm going to save this for you as well. So I'll save that in the same folder as just lens distortion out. Lens distortion out .nuke. So you've got that. Let's shut down Nuke. There's our render just finishing off. So I'm just going to stop that for a moment. I'm going to save the image. Let's delete this one. Let's come back to our render settings. I'm going to turn these down just a little bit because they're slowing us down. We don't want to have to wait too long for anything. Again, load our camera. Here we're going to go with our UV. So I'm going to click on here. I'm going to go with an Arnold texture, which is the AI image, and I'm going to load into that the UV map that we just made. So there it is. If we now do a render, dropping back to our camera settings, let's do a render of that, we now should see a significant difference in the look of our scene. You can see as I move back and forth, you can definitely see, even though it's only a small section in the middle of the first one, quite significant change in our lens distortion taking place. So again, I wouldn't necessarily recommend doing this, just because we know that once it's baked in, we can't really get rid of it, or we may not want to, because if we want to get rid of it, it's going to be a filter hit inside of Nuke. But it's again there and useful to you if you want to use it. So I'm going to leave it on for this instance, though. As I said, I usually wouldn't recommend it, but it's nice just to have it so we can have all these things kind of working for us as we look at the final image at the end of the class. And then finally we have our camera motion blur, and this is specific to this camera. Now, if you remember, we've already looked at motion blur a little bit with our render settings. You can see that's down here. We can enable it, and then we have it working. But this is where you would set it specifically for the camera. So I can say this camera is definitely off. This camera is using the global settings, which means that if it's on here, then it's going to be on for this camera, or I can say it's definitely going to be off. Okay, so you can determine what you want to use for that. And then finally we have our shutter start and shutter end, and this allows you to define the start and end positions for the motion range of the motion blur. So normally I just leave it at 0 to 1, though you may choose to make it -1 to 0, whatever you fancy. Usually these are a pretty good setup for what we're going with. So there are all your camera settings. From here, let's go across and look at some individual object settings or per object settings. So let's just close this up. I'm going to shut this and let's just focus on this man, for instance. When I click on his head, you can see that here under the character's head shape, we have this Arnold section here. When I open this, you can see there are actually quite a number of different things I can do in here. So first off, we can determine whether it's a polymesh or a mesh light. And you might remember this is useful if you want this now to kind of illuminate light. So if I put it on and I put the exposure up to something like 5, and let's come back to here. Yeah, let's just render, say, this section. In fact, we'll do an IPR. What you'll immediately see is his head is now gone because we haven't switched on the ability to kind of see the light, but now that's going to be illuminating the scene around it. So if I come to somewhere like here and then begin to increase this, say 25, way too high, 15, still quite high, let's try 8, that's a little bit better. So you can see his head now is illuminating the rest of the scene because we've set that to be a mesh light, and we talked about that last week. And again, if you remember, we can set the visibility so that now we can actually see his glowing head. Okay, so that's a per object setting. All the other bits and pieces regarding this we've already talked about. So I'm just going to turn his head back to normal. Just close that down. Now next up we have 4 checkboxes, and all of these are really useful. Firstly, we have self-shadowing. This basically determines whether the object can cast shadows onto itself. So we can see if we grab this tree, for instance, this is with self-shadowing on. If I turn self-shadowing off, and I'm just going to save that image. Let's just delete some of these, make sure that one's saved, and re-render. This is what it looks like with self-shadowing off. So if we go back and forth, you can see that's the difference we're getting with self-shadowing. Okay, so I'll leave that back on. Let's just go back to the character's head for a moment. Then we have opaque here, and what this basically does is this determines whether the object is considered opaque. Now for various kind of shortcuts that Arnold does, having this on basically speeds up the render, but if we need something to be transparent, this basically needs to be off. So if we stay with his head and we just come down and we switch opaque off, let's come to here and we're just going to come in and increase the weight of refraction, which is going to make it translucent. Let's draw a box around here. And this is what it looks like when it is set to opaque off and we've got some translucency taking place. So if I just do a quick render, got a refraction index of 1.48, which is somewhere around glass. You can see we're getting quite a nice kind of transparent look to that, and if I was to push this up even more, we're going to get even more transparency. So let's see what that's going to give us. Now in order to get rid of the yellow, I'd need to take my diffuse weight down, and I may just bring this down just a little bit, and again re-render. So we've got no diffuse contribution now. You can see something much more glass-like now. Okay, so if I save that, you can see obviously a big difference between these. But now come and have a look at what happens if I put opaque on and re-render. So if we go back and forth, you can see definitely towards the bottom there's quite a big difference. Here we're getting this kind of dark area. And when we have the opaque off, we're getting much more glass-like effect. So basically the opaque flag, when it's disabled, we have that switched off if we want the shadows cast by objects with refraction to pick up the refraction color, which is obviously what we want. So I'm going to probably leave that off, and just come back and just add a little bit of diffuse contribution into that. And the rest of it I'm going to leave as is, maybe not quite so translucent, 0.65, and I'm going to go with a yellowish colour for this as well, but not quite so bright. Maybe something like that. Okay, so that's going to give us, if we render that, a little bit of a yellow look to the glass. There we go. Okay, so a little bit nicer. Maybe bring this up. Maybe a little whiter. Forget that last render, just go with this one. So there we go, a little bit of a yellow tinge to that. I quite like that. Now, next up, we have this visibility in diffuse and visibility in glossy. And what this basically does is it disables an object's visibility for the various types of rays in the renderer. So basically this is stopping this object emitting the color being kind of used in the rays for the diffuse and glossy samples. So for instance, if you had a mirror and you took visibility in glossy out or switched it off, that object would no longer be visible in the mirror because the mirror is using glossy samples. If you had an object that was close to something else and it was emitting some of the color, like the red from his top, onto another object, that's obviously being used for global illumination, GI rays, that kind of thing. If you turned off diffuse, you're not going to see that contribution onto the other object. Okay, so that's what those do. Now, next up, we have subdivision surfaces. And to show you this, I'm just going to move away from this scene for a moment. So let's just go to our perspective. And in fact, I'm just going to save this. And I'm going to just make another scene very quickly because it's easier to explain this way. So this is going to be 4. And we're just going to call this opaque so we remember what that is. Let's quickly make a new scene. And this is just through way of trying to make it easy for you to visualize what's happening with the subdivisions. So here we've got this, and I'm going to make a GI light, a sky dome. And if I render that, we're obviously going to see something like that. Obviously we need to render it with Arnold, otherwise it's going to look horrible. There we have it. Now onto this, I'm going to apply a wireframe shader. So assign new material, shaders, wireframe, and when I now render this, we're going to see this. So I'm going to turn the triangles to polys, and let's make the line width just a little bit more. So that's going to give us that. Okay. And I'm going to turn my render down. That's interesting. Well, let's come back. Turn my render down. I think I just moved there. Let's go with just a square format for this one. So 1k square, and then drop this down to maybe 600. Okay, so that's what we've got going on. Now, if we come into our subdivisions, we've basically got Catmull, Clark, or linear. So if we put it onto linear, and I save this and delete our other ones for the time being, and zoom in. So this is on linear. What you can see, it's now subdivided this, but kept the same shape. Okay, again, if I do 2, it's now going to subdivide it again, and we're going to get even more, but the shape remains. Put it back to 0. Let's put it to Catmull Clark, render, nothing at all. However, if I do 1 iteration, we're now getting the subdivisions that we saw on the cube, but we're now seeing this change shape. 2 iterations, much more like a sphere. 3, even more, probably as close as we want to go, and 5 is definitely going to be now very smooth and subdivided. Now the other settings are really more fine detail regarding how the subdivisions are working. For instance, the first two are to do with what's happening if you're using displacements, and we'll be talking about displacements in the next couple of classes as we get into shaders. Dicing cameras is looking at how these subdivision calculations take place when you have cameras that are moving and you might see some flickering or something like that. And then you have other bits and pieces such as the UV smoothing, which is just different methods to use for the UV smoothing taking place. Finally, this smooth tangent, that can be used if you're getting weird faceted things appearing on your surface, if you're using anisotropic specular highlights. Okay, so again, all this is a little bit more complicated and we're just not going to have the time to go into it at the moment. So let's just close this down and we'll save this scene as subdivisions, and then we will go on and look at the last section. So let's call back our initial scene. Now let's say for instance that we want to make, say, a washing line that runs from, say, this tree to this tree. So let's just grab this tree, we'll move it into place. Let's now go across to our Bezier curve tool, and in our top view let's set up our wire that's going to run from one tree to the other. Now let me just say, the Bezier curve that we're using at the moment, we're actually going to have to change this because the support for rendering curves doesn't include this particular type of curve. So we are going to have to change it, but I always find it's much easier to model with this kind of curve than normal curves. I do like this. Okay, so there's our line. There's our rope or washing line, whatever we want to call it. Okay, now if I come back to the object mode and we come back across to the curve itself, you'll see that there's actually under shape no Arnold attributes either there or here. And that's because, as I said, this is the wrong type of curve. So the way we're going to do this is we're going to just grab the hotbox, modify, convert, and then here you see there's a Bezier curve to NURBS. And this will now create a NURBS curve. And with our NURBS curve selected, come back to here, you can now see we have this Arnold section that we didn't have before. So now we can say render the curve. So if we just hide everything else for a moment, so let's hide the house and the man, let's focus in on the trees, let's do a quick IPR and grab this section where the curve is. You can now really clearly see we've got this really lovely curve taking place, and we now can come in and make some changes. So for instance, we can say the color of the curve, well, let's go white. Shader rate, obviously this is the quality of the shader. If we drop it down, we're not going to get such a nice curve. As we increase it, we're going to get a smoother, nicer look. We can also increase the overall thickness. So I can make it thicker, much thicker. In fact, if I re-render the IPR, you can see it's really thick. Sometimes some of these attributes don't seem to update depending on what you're doing, especially this one. So 0.25, let's see what that looks like. Again, update the IPR. That seems to be looking quite a lot nicer. You can also do all the normal things like whether it's self-shadowing, whether it appears in the primary visibilities, cast shadows, a lot of the things you'd be used to there. Okay. Underneath that we've got mode, and this has a number of options in it, including ribbon and thickness. Now ribbon is great for fine geometry such as hair, fur or fields of grass, whereas thickness resembles something more like spaghetti. It has a kind of a circular cross section. So depending on what you need, you can either go with ribbon or go with thickness. Now one other thing, if we just come back to our camera. Now if we wanted to have this so you couldn't actually see him but he was still kind of being involved with the scene, you would normally do that by switching off obviously its kind of primary visibility. So the way we can do this is we can select the man, select him in his entirety, and we can go ahead and we can make a set to put him in. So I'm just going to go create, set, set, go across to here. You can see we've got our set with our character in it. I'm just going to rename this to be character set. I can then come to Arnold, make sure override is on. I'm going to say add. Let's look for our primary visibility. There it is. So I'm just going to add that, and then I can turn off primary visibility there on that particular set. So if we now come back to camera and do a render, we should see now that our primary visibility of that man is gone, which is exactly what's happened. So you can do this on a set basis or a per object basis as well if you wanted to. Okay, so you can still see there's some contribution to the man there, especially if we wanted to change the floor to something else. We just create, say, a polygon primitive, a plane, and we were then to texture this, you'd really see that we're still getting something going on. So let's just assign a new material. Let's assign an ambient occlusion material, and you'll see even with the man primary visibility switched off, we're still going to be seeing the ambient occlusion coming from the man. There you go, there's his Lego feet stood there. So although he's off, we're still getting all that contribution coming in. So that's per object or per set attributes. Again, I'm just going to remove that. Remove. Okay, so we can get rid of that. Let's bring back the house, and then just line our camera up for our final render. Okay, so that is bringing us to the end of the class. I'm going to hit render on this, and I'll include this at the very end once it's rendered through. Okay, so that takes us to the end of this week's class. If you've got any questions on anything we've covered, please put them in the forums. If there's anything you spotted that we kind of scooted past and you're more interested in than we had a chance to talk about, please again ask your questions and we'll get to them as quickly as we can. Next week and the week after, we're going to be talking about shaders and textures, so that's going to be exciting. We'll go through and look at all the different shaders and things that we can do with them. Obviously there are many, so we're just going to hit the main ones, and again, if you have questions in those weeks about shaders that we may have missed, please ask your questions in the forums. So until then, as always, this has been Matt Leonard for FX PhD.